This class is, I think in the syllabus, it's working with a research team. And shortly after not exactly inherited, but was asked if I was willing to take on the remainder of Sally's second Informationist grant, I was also asked if I wanted to talk about it here and whether I wanted to present what I had done to future library and information professionals who are interested in similar things. And because it was my director asking, I said yes. So I only graduated library school in December. So I have been a professional for less than a year. As Julie said, before that I worked in a research lab. So my background is in pediatric cardiology genetic research. I worked with a lot of mice, did a lot of basic bench science, and realized that what I enjoyed and what I was good at about that was the information side about that. I enjoyed making sure that the information that was relevant was being received by the people who needed it more than necessarily sitting with the mice and the pipettes and you know, doing that forever. So medical librarianship was always my goal, and the opportunity to stay involved with biomedical sciences in a library-focused and information-based role was very exciting, although it has been an interesting project so far. So this is one of my favorite comics. It was published in a special section of the journal Science when they did a full open access supplement. And this is just a very sort of silly yet informative way to look at why research teams need librarians now. And this is the proliferation of scientific publishing. This went from, you can see all the way at the top, it's 140 citations per page. You were looking at, you know, 5,000 or 10,000 page books a decade. We are now looking at hundreds of millions of publications, and the rate at which things are being published, the rate at which new data is being produced, and the fact that open access mandates have said that that data needs to be available, means that there's all of this new information and new research floating around. And while the researchers will go as far as they're required with their, you know, national mandates to make their research data available, to make it accessible to the public because it's publicly funded, unless there is a reason, they will go no further. And I think that a lot of that reason falls to librarians and to information professionals to help make sure that that data is not only available, but is actually usable. And those are very different things. Okay, so today I have 4 main sections. Just a little bit of discussion about how a librarian and a research team can actually interact. The different kinds of librarians and research teams, the models that there are out there, they have been tried by a lot of different libraries. A lot of times they're utilized in different ways by the same library. And then how can librarians prepare themselves for these positions, because they are out there and they are becoming more important and more common. And then at the end, I will walk you through the current state of the Informationist grant that I am working on. Okay. So, working with research teams. The first question that you always really want to ask when you're starting a new relationship with a research team is, what can you add? Why are you there? And there are a lot of the, you know, sort of obvious basic library skills, the information organization, the data management, the, you know, planning, things like that, that we're so good at, resource discovery, letting people know what we have that they should be using. But there are also a lot of areas where libraries are stepping up on research teams to meet needs that maybe aren't being met or are more complex than first assumed. Copyright and intellectual property information, authors' rights, publishing agreements. These are all things that are being thought of in libraries and that researchers need to know about. because a lot of these things affect what can be done with their research, who retains the rights to that publication. Grant writing and compliance, all of these national mandates for open access data, NSF, NIH, all of these, they have requirements. And I know our library spent a lot of time this year helping all of the researchers who were willing to come down for a class to figure out the new NIH grant submission, because it not only required them to write a grant, but it also required them to create a biosketch that traced their publications and their contributions to science and how that was involved in why they should be getting these grants. And this was, instead of just writing a biosketch that was, this is me, this is my research, here's why it's important, you had to actually show the impact that your science had on the greater field. So, I mean, any other thoughts as what librarians can bring? Because it's not a limited list. There is no end to the things that library can contribute to a research team. A lot of it will depend on the specialization of the librarian. You may have expertise that they didn't know they needed. Sally talks about some of that, is that having subject expertise can help, but it's not always required. It depends on the team, depends on the relationship. Okay. So then the other thing is, what can librarians gain from working on a research team? Because you never want these to be one-way relationships. You don't want to be there as support staff. So it's not only about what can you provide sort of passively to these teams, it's what can you gain, what can you add to your own knowledge that you can then take forward. So the first one is subject expertise. Anytime you're working with one of these teams, there's a lot of background reading, there's a lot of catch-up to do to understand what it is that they're working on, whether it's clinical study, whether it's basic science, whether it's translational biomedical research in bringing, bench work to the bedside. So the other thing, fostering collaborations and furthering partnerships. Anytime that you are working with a team, you're going to come into contact with a lot of other people, especially in the sciences. Departments are very connected. People move around labs, people change fields as their research evolves, as their grant funding changes, because they, have one project funded and not another. So having these people out there who know that you are a good member of a team and that you contribute and that you can be useful, it helps widen the circle of people who would then think to come to the library to create these new teams. So the more successful you can be, the more opportunity it sort of cultivates for further partnerships. And then new perspectives. When you are working on a team like that, it's interesting because it can take you out of the library bubble. We see what we know what we have. We always think about all of these resources that we're willing to provide to people, but sometimes it's simply that it's not marketed well, that people don't know about it. So it can be very interesting to get a new perspective on the library, see what needs aren't being met, that people ask you questions and sometimes the response is, I don't know if we do that yet. But it's always an opportunity to say, well, maybe we could. Maybe we could look into why that's not something that we have available. So the three different kinds of librarian research team librarians that I'm going to talk about are liaison librarians, embedded librarians, and then the informationists. And while there are places where those names are interchangeable, I'm sort of presenting them as three distinct levels of involvement with the research team. So the first is liaison librarians, and this is one that is pretty common in academic libraries. We do a lot of this in our own library, where you have librarians who are centralized, who stay, they have their offices in the library, they do most of their time there, but they have departments to who they are the go-to contact, where they go out and participate in grand rounds, or they go out to research seminars and learn about the new studies being done by those teams so that they can be aware of the needs of those departments and that they can help personalize the library service as opposed to somebody sending a general email to ask a librarian with a very sometimes in-depth and involved question that is better done with a personal contact, whether or not that person is, there or not. So in general, that's a librarian first kind of position. You don't necessarily have to have any expertise to be the liaison. You're going to need to put in the work to know what they are doing and to know what they are working on and what they might need. But you don't necessarily need a second master's degree in every department that you are the liaison to. And you can do this at more than one group at a time. It's not necessarily an all-consuming relationship. You can do this with your other duties. You can do this with your time in the library. So yeah, things like LibGuides. That's a good liaison activity. You can personalize it to whatever the department needs. We have ones where medical, clinical fellowship departments have had their LibGuides personalized such that their weekly articles are posted for them. And it's behind, a paywall or a sign-in. So it's only those fellows who are seeing the material, but it's one centralized place where not only can they get the articles that their preceptor was talking about last week at clinical rounds, but also the background research to it or any studies that have come out that relate to the same things. Okay, so embedded librarians. Embedded librarians, when I'm talking about them, are those generally where you are a member of another department or a member of a team with the library experience. So a lot of time this will be where you have a desk somewhere outside the library so that you are in the place where your users are, as opposed to making them come to you. Often this is done with librarians who are also subject specialists. They can be embedded in academic departments, they can be embedded in coursework, they can be embedded in curricula. So they are also librarians, but this is a lot of times where you see those very high-level subject expertise. The other place that you see embedded librarianship is online learning environments. I know that a lot of library schools now are being done with online classes. And how does having a librarian who has access to your course, materials, who knows the projects that you're working on, that can be significantly more helpful to the students than just having a general library where they can go to search for things on their own. Okay. Any questions? Please feel free to interrupt me at any time. Okay. So this is actually a book that came out just before I started library school, and so we read it in my academic library class, and it's very interesting because not only is it about how librarians can do embedded librarianship, but also what that means for library management. How do you manage a library where none of your librarians are sitting in the desk? How do you make sure that they're professionally supported? How do you make sure that there's the interactions between librarians as well as the interactions between librarians and their research teams? So if you need any extra reading. So informationists are sort of a new category. Informationists in this sense, rather than just in the new term for librarians, is actually project-based and NIH funded. And so as Elaine was discussing, these are very specific supplemental grants that are given to teams or to principal investigators who have what are often very large multi-year NIH grants to do all sorts of different research. So yes, so these are location independent. You don't necessarily need to be on the same campus. As you were saying, research and move all the time. So there are projects that are being done that are grant funded across multiple continents. Your biostatistician may be in Europe and your data collectors may be in India and your PI may be in Oregon, and that's how it is. And so you can assumedly be an informationist even in that situation, or you can be on the same campus and going, having weekly meetings in the department conference room with your research team. So how can you prepare for these roles? The honest answer is I'm not sure there is any specific way. You have to be willing to put in the work. These are not easy roles. There is a lot of learning on the job and making sure that you're taking into account the actual needs of your research team. A lot of times you may have ideas of how things should be done because it's efficient and because that's, best practices in the library world, but if it's not going to work for that research situation, you're going to have to rethink it. So, the obvious ones are read, write, and talk. We talked about the blog. There are a lot of really good resources out there, both in the formal literature. JESLib publishes, all sorts of e-science type material. These are projects that are being done that, are really, really interesting. And knowing what your institution is working on. So wherever you are, having some sort of grasp of the emerging research can allow you to help sort of position yourself at the forefront of that and proactively get yourself ready in case they do come to you and say, we have something that could benefit from an informationist supplement. Grant writing, report writing, paper publishing, all of this is really good experience because all of that is part of being an informationist. And it's a little intimidating when you're doing it sort of off the cuff. And then presenting and networking. You never know who's listening. If you present your research, if you present whatever you're doing, whether it's in your library or outside of your library, go to talks, go to seminars, you never know. And obviously networking, because that's a lot of it. It's about personal relationships. And so if they don't know you're there, they'll never know to ask for you. Okay. So here's one thing when you're thinking about these kinds of library relationships, and does being in the library matter? So we've talked about the difference between centralized or decentralized library services, whether or not you are in the library with all the librarians. So that obviously has the benefit of you have the professional support, you have all of your colleagues around you, but it means that you're not around your research team. It means that you're missing out on the day-to-day interaction. But if you are at a desk in a department, how does that keep you from maybe expanding your library connections? It can be very hard to remember that there are users out there who may not be part of your department, but who could benefit from library services. So any other thoughts? What else? What other considerations do you have for these kinds of positions? Because they're popping up more and more. People want librarians with subject expertise. They want them with experience working with these sort of out-of-library research projects. The support you get from colleagues, even in the form of, oh, hey, did you hear about what this library is doing? You may not get if you're only in your department. The other thing is we've heard of libraries who have tried doing this decentralized model and found that their users actually really don't like it. They want to be able to go to one place and find a librarian, whether or not it's their librarian. Especially if you are embedded or the liaison to multiple departments, how do you balance that? If your desk is in family medicine, but you're also the liaison to emergency, how do you make sure that they're not looking for you in one place while you happen to be sitting at the other?
Leah, one of the questions I have with social media and our use of this, do you think it's made it easier to be an embedded librarian, or do you think it's made it more complicated?
Probably both. I do think that social media has opened up a lot of avenues for professional communication that maybe were harder previously. There are hashtags, there are blogs, there are regular Twitter conversations for lots of different library groups. I mean, MedLibs is the one that comes to mind, but it can be easy. It can be easy to find people who are working on, problems or issues that may be similar to yours, whether or not having a, friend on Twitter is the same as having a colleague. Some people are more socially active than others. There are people who love going to conferences because they get to meet in real life all the people that they talk to on a regular basis. There are entire collaborations and papers that come out of blog comments. So it definitely can be positive, but it can be, I think, probably isolating because it's very easy to get lost in that wider conversation because especially if you're new or if you are unsure of what you're doing, it can be really hard to throw that out there when everybody else is posting about how they have everything together and how, their project went so well or things like that. Questions, comments? Yeah.
I know that the idea of informationist is still really new, but would you see people making a career out of it, they would just kind of hop from informationist position to informationist position, or would they kind of use it as a way to transition into an embedded librarian or subject specialist role?
I don't see it as necessarily a career path right now because there are so few of these grants and they are short term. These are 18-month, 2-year grants. I think you'd have to be really lucky and really good at what you do and willing to move around because you're never guaranteed to get one at the same institution or even in the same city. But I think that if enough of them can be shown to be successful and to be contributing to the scientific conversation and the scholarly body of work, that they may become accepted and that it may not have to be a supplemental grant, that this may be understood to be a useful part of regular research grant writing. That maybe if you are doing something that will be data intensive or that will produce large amounts of various kinds of data that you know that you're going to need to do something with, and you've written your data management plan but don't really have any sort of action plan to follow it, that may be an awareness that we can help.
I think what you're really asking about is sustainability.
Yeah, and I guess I'm thinking would an academic department of the university just hire an informationist just for them who would consult on all of their research projects or something like that? So it would be kind of completely separate from the library. I wonder if that.
The original article was written by Valerie Florence and Frank Davidoff, and it called for that model actually, that physicians in the article, because it was written in the Annals of Internal Medicine, would become librarians. They would have their MD, they would get potentially trained in library science and serve as informationists in their clinical departments. And when that article first came out, the library community, was really concerned about what that article talked about because librarians were being written out of these things. But what's happened is that it's not the physicians who are becoming librarians and taking on these roles. It's librarians who are learning more about science and clinical and taking on these roles. But the sustainability is complex because departments taking on librarians who are not faculty and paying them as if they were faculty, you take up faculty slots, and then that becomes if you're a faculty slot, you have to self-support yourself in an academic health sciences environment. So you always have to be grant funded somehow. So the funding model in health sciences is very different than one might find in other type of academic institution. And that's why sustainability of this is, in my mind, always questionable, because you're always gonna have to follow the money. And right now, these informationist grants, the thought was they'd be clinically funded. You know, they work with hospital kind of things, but the reality is now the money's in data, and it's in big data, and so what's happening is these grants are specified that you work with big data. You know, it's not, and you know, the next thing that comes around is gonna be precision medicine. And so the next funding cycle might go with that, so you're always just kind of shifting from where the funding source is to write these librarians into these project teams, which don't always translate well if you don't have the background to move from clinical to data and now to precision medicine, and you know, the next iteration of who knows what it's going to be, whatever the government decides to, you know, put hundreds of millions of dollars into. So I think the sustainability question is a really good question, and I in my mind, I still haven't, you know, I'm not sure, you know, what's going to happen with this. We've been successful twice because of the people we have on these projects, but our faculty are not coming to us, you know, we push them down the door saying, I'm ready to librarian in a grant. So it's not, I think it's that, you know, the jury's still out. I'm not sure.
I think another part of that too, in terms of sustainability, and where you might be isolated, you know, concern of being isolated, and then also in order to prove your worth, you know, and like Elaine said, you know, why not hire faculty? Why hire an informationist? You know, and then following the trends and learning about the trends and making a case for why you should remain in that research group. And then of course if there's two PIs and one leaves or both of them leaves or something happens, there goes that whole, you know, there goes your livelihood. So it's, you're right, the sustainability is.
And the Indiana project basically fell apart because the research PI left and took the team with them. But the librarian was part of the University of Indiana, so she was staying great. And so that project never really got off the ground. So, yeah, it's really hard when you're attached to a research project, you know, where when that project ends and when that funding ends, you know, what will happen with these positions. And the libraries, from my perspective, is we're never going to have enough information if that continues as the model where you're attached to a grant, is how many of these can you do? I mean, we only have, you know, a few librarians, and if every one of them is attached to a grant at some point, we'll never have enough librarians, never, you know, do it. So that's another issue, is like, you have to pick and choose which ones of these you're going to work with, because we don't have enough people.
So if you're attached to a grant, and is your funding through the grant, like you're hired by the grant, so you're really not
So in our
part
case,
of the library necessarily. Like it sounds like in Indiana.
well, you are, but like in our case, first of all, the funding doesn't cover the full salary of the person.
Oh, got it.
So partial time is funded through the grant.
Okay.
Might be 45% or 30%, depending on how much the funding is. And then the other part is funded by the library.
Okay.
But I haven't seen any of these grants that can fund a librarian full-time. And I think that's the other piece, is if it was going to be, you were going to be an informationist full-time, you probably would have to work on multiple grants, just like faculty do, in order to fund yourself at 100%. So that's another issue in my mind, is how do you continue to keep funding these people at 100%? And that's a faculty issue. And you know, and for the library, we don't have the ability to hire people even fast enough to work like 45% on one grant for 6 months, and then you know, you wait until you get another grant and you bring them on for another 45%, and people don't want to work like that either. You know, so you end up doing is taking what you have already in the library and saying, would you be willing to do this for part of your time? And then it's about sustainability too. If you just don't have enough people to keep doing that, after a while people get worn out.
And if they're doing something, working on other projects or subject liaisons to other departments, who will take on part of their work or who will help out. And when you have such a small staff, that is problematic.
Yeah, and you don't get enough money to backfill. That's the other
Right.
issue. That's 25% of somebody's time or 20% of somebody's time. You can't hire someone to do the work this person isn't doing because you only have 20% of the salary. No one's going to do that for a day week either. So there are, in my mind, still a lot of questions about this model and the way it's funded. And that, will hold it back, I think, long term.
On a positive note,
Yes.
I think the skills that you learn in this, and I think I don't want to speak about this, will be invaluable moving forward in this environment. And of course, the skills you're learning here will be invaluable as well because they can be used as a subject specialist, as embedded librarian, liaison, as whatever skills you have. Because you never know when you're working with a particular faculty in a department, you talk about what you can do, what that will bring. And it may not mean a grant, but it might mean doing a systematic review, helping them with IR, things like that. And Leah's going to talk about
I don't think it's even just the skills that you learn as much as knowing that you have the skills to bring
it.
already. It's just framing it in a way that this audience understands. And we've been very lucky that the research teams we've worked with have been very accepting of the library professionals that have been on their teams. And they've proven themselves, though both Sally and Leah have done a great job representing the profession and what the profession can bring to these teams. And I think that's really important, that we to have the confidence to know that you really do have these skills. And so,
It's really helpful to me that you were putting out sort of the skills that they would be looking for, because when I think about that sort of situation, I'm not sure what we bring. I mean, I know the obvious things of like reference and also like how to organize things, but I don't know how to present it in such a way that would be, understood by a research team. Like, what are they looking for? I really don't know. But again, I also am coming at it from not having domain knowledge. I don't know if any of you would be looking at professions that you don't have domain knowledge in already. But that's one thing that I'm concerned listening to what you all are having to what I'm talking about, because I mean it's clear that you're coming in with domain knowledge, and I think that a lot of what you were saying, like doing a lot of reading and keeping up on the literature, is a great way to have a basis. But if I'm coming in with like nothing, I don't know if that's true for anybody else. But I know for me, I'm coming in with very little experience, but I'm interested in science libraries. And so, what do I have to bring to the table that does not involve domain knowledge more than I can teach myself necessarily? I don't know if that's a concern for either.
Yeah, I think definitely, my background is in humanities,
Yeah.
but I think that this is, I think we have a lot to bring, but I think that's a very valid concern.
How do I present it to people who speak a different language than I do necessarily?
and maybe it's going back to those different levels of this liaison embedded informationist. And I think what was meant by the informationist model, as written by Florence and David, the subject specialization was quite important.
Mm-hmm.
In that pure informationist model. However, Leah brought up points that there are levels of embeddedness and liaison work that maybe that specialization isn't necessary, but yet those skills can still be brought to the table. But the intent of the informationist, as it was published and written, was that one would have domain knowledge and be first, right? And that one could be taught library information skills. But it wasn't that you had library information skills and then you were taught the domain knowledge. Where we can do that with embeddedness and we can do that with liaison librarian.
Okay, that makes sense. I hope.
I think it's because of the level in which one is becoming part of the team. As the informationist, you're an equal member of that team. And, it's different. I think the true informationist model is different.
I would say even the model as it stands, it is still different because you are coming into an established team and working on a project that has gotten to the point of needing data management skills. So while you are absolutely a contributing member of the team, you're not the one doing the data creation. You're not designing experiments. You're not running clinical trials. So there is a level of separation, and I mean, classes like this are invaluable because you can use data management principles, whether you're looking at clinical chart information, whether you're looking at, tables of data from basic science labs, whether you're looking at, government collected statistics. There are huge humanities data sets out there. People who are doing analysis of various types of literature, the history and the tracing the, chronology of the influence of various theories or religious thought or philosophies. All of this needs data management, and I think that I happen to luck into the fact that my background matched reasonably well with their needs, but there was also a really steep learning curve. So I think having a background in knowing how to develop these kinds of plans and services is really helpful.
Is that just about quantitative? I mean, there's qualitative
Absolutely.
aspects to this, in humanities with text mining and everything about digital humanities is qualitative. Social sciences, in some cases.
I mean, even Sally's clinical one had, the first aim was communication. That had nothing to do with the research being done. That had to do with how it was being dealt with once it was collected.
Yeah, and if you follow her blog, if you've been
Reading her blog, visualization is a key term, a key skill that's being promoted right now, and you'll see it's popping up everywhere around the world, in social media, news programs, that being able to visualize all of that data is so important in a way that people can understand it, and not just those little tables and graphs, in different ways.
So what I think is one of the really interesting pieces of this is to figure out how accepted one gets as part of the team if you don't have domain knowledge versus the library skills, or the library skills versus the knowledge. And we were fortunate that in both cases we were able to select which projects we wanted to work with in applying for this money. And the library had really good relationships with both of these particular groups. And they already saw librarians as valuable. Now, there are a lot of teams that don't know what librarians do or understand how valuable they can be, and it may be a harder sell to figure out what kind of level of acceptance there would be within that team. And so, I was just at the NIH last week, and for a meeting of grantees who had gotten awards for a similar thing related to data and education, and most of the people in that room were computer scientists, data scientists, and had no idea that librarians, do this work. And we're surprised that we had gotten funded. So,
Sorry.
yeah, and part of
Wipe
it,
that off.
and it was like 3 or 4 of us who had gotten money, similar to this informationist thing. One from Hopkins, us, and NYU. And our job there was basically, advocating that librarian belonged in that room and could be part of their teams and work on these projects. So I think that's one of the challenges of this particular role. That if you have a good relationship already with these teams that you're working with, you don't have to do that hard sell, but a lot of libraries don't. And to come in and try to do this work can be a difficult sell. And if you don't do it well, they won't ask you back. So that's another piece of it too. It's very complex, I think. And what I think would be very interesting is, as a research project, is the dynamics of the team. And how does putting a librarian on the team change the dynamics of the team? And what makes a successful team when you have librarians on it and researchers on it, and there may be some characteristics that we could study as a project, like what makes a successful informationist team. And I don't think anybody's doing any work on that. I think it would be interesting. If you want to do a project, I think that would be an interesting project.
This part of my talk is about what I am actually doing and what the informational supplement grant that I joined is working towards. So the sort of peppy title that we came up with is the Data Identification, Citation, and Reuse, a case study in a neuroimaging repository. And the grant that this is attached to is actually coming up on the 5th out of 5 years on an R01 NIH grant. And before that, it had 2 years funded on a K grant, which are just different classes of NIH grants. The title is A Knowledge Environment for Neuroimaging in Child Psychiatry. And over the course of these 7 years, it has been funded at just under $3.5 million. So this is not a small project, and this is a project that has been going on for a very long time. So I did sort of join in the middle, but I joined at a point when they had sort of succeeded in creating the original repository and knowledge environment, which is how they first put it, that they had set out to make. And it's out there and it's existing and it's well-respected subject repository for neuroimages. But then they have realized that while it's great that you have a repository and you have this place to host your data and to put your software tools and to do your cloud computing and do all of these sort of analyses on neuroimages, which is usually, in this case, MRI scans, so just pictures of brains. There was no good way to make sure that it was coming back out again. So that once things got posted, unless you were the person who posted it and were writing a second paper about the same data, reuse was not necessarily being done and not being done well. And so that's what they wanted to focus on, because in the neuroimaging community, reusing data that somebody else made is completely acceptable, because if you are looking for a specific physiological effect in 20 to 25-year-old males who happen to be left-handed, there may not be that many in one place. But if you have a repository of 100,000 MRI scans that have been collected for all sorts of various reasons from all sorts of various places, it's a lot easier to find a larger sample size that meet your criteria. Okay. Yeah.
They were having trouble seeing if people were getting things out and seeing
Yes.
if there was reuse happening, not if they could get things out.
Right. No, not the physical not whether or not they could download it again or whether they could see that image again. It was whether or not that data was having any further impact, whether it was going anywhere after it had, it was created, a paper was written, this data set was created over the course of the research that resulted in the paper, and then it got uploaded to a repository. and it sort of ended on a then what. So that's what the Informationist supplement was designed to do. So we had 3 main aims, similar to the ones that are talked about in Sally's Informationist paper. Data identification. First question is, if you are going to cite something, or if you're going to use something, you need to be able to uniquely and permanently identify it. And while that is not a novel concept, people have been citing papers since, science publication started. Doing it with data requires a sort of shift in thought, because data is not one thing. It's not a permanent thing. A data set can change. A data set can be subdivided. Sometimes you don't necessarily need the whole data set, or sometimes you need data from multiple data sets. And all of these things, you need to be able to pinpoint exactly what it is you're using, rather than trying to describe it and hope that somebody reading your paper understands. So the second point is data reproducibility. So this goes to the reuse case, that if you are publishing results based on a specific set of data, the entire point of science is that somebody should be able to use that same data and run those same tests and get those same results. And that's what peer review is. That's what the whole replication scandal in science is, that all these studies posted these results, but nobody can reproduce them. That, there's no way to know that that wasn't a fluke, because maybe the original data is not available. Maybe the conditions weren't recorded in such a way that you could ever actually repeat those experiments. And then the third part for this project is, how do you maintain credit when you are citing data? In academic science, citations and credit and authorship are important. And so if you are going to willingly post your data for other people to reuse, you want to be able to know who is using it, what they're using it for, how often is it being reused, and what particular parts are being reused. Because you can say that 10 papers have referenced my data set, but maybe they really are all using the same single MRI image. And it's that one that shows something specific. But how do you get that signal out of the noise of citing an entire data set? So it's sort of audacious and large in its project, but we have been making progress. So beyond the paper citation, so data identification, how to uniquely identify and cite data, and is citing a data set enough? So the question of granularity. So this is the difference between data and a data set. I'm working particularly with MRI images, but you can think of it as if your data is an Excel sheet. That's a table. It's got columns, it's got rows, it's got all of your data included in it. But somebody comes along and only needs columns A through C. How do you cite that? How do you make sure that it's clear what data they're actually using? So if you have an identifier that only identifies the whole unit, that whole table, that's not the same as what they're using. And what you need to make sure is that when you are using something that is an identifier, that is a unique and permanent identifier, is that it has the level of granularity needed to recapitulate the data used. So this was actually a very long-standing argument between me and the PI of this project. And he was insistent that in neuroimaging, in this repository community, every single scan needed its own identifier. And I brought up a couple of alternatives that I thought were better and that were more efficient. And over the course of working through our project, he was right. And so I will show you, we have a test database, and every single image has its own DOI. And that's needed within the context of creating new data sets and citing them correctly. Yeah. Well, so our DOI our EasyID subscription came with 1 million DOIs. We're seeing how long they last. So the second part was the replication and reproducibility. So yeah, so scientific rigor is based on the idea that an experiment should be reproducible and its results replicated no matter who does the experiment. So the real question is, how can this be done if you can't ensure that the data set you start with is the same one that they're talking about? And for an example, so in general, if you were using somebody else's data, there would be either a description in your methodology saying data was received from project X and we used all but number 12. Or creators would be thanked at the end of the paper, thanks to this lab for providing the data, or they would be given authorship or listed under contributors as data creators or as the source of the data. And while that's all well and good, it is geared towards the human reader and is subject to interpretation. And so while you may think you very clearly described exactly what data you used, it's not necessarily enough, and it can lead to all sorts of interesting things. So this is actually from a paper from the group who is now working with our project, and this is in their methodology section, is the data analyses. So due to sparse numbers of left-handed subjects making stratified analysis difficult, only data from right-handed subjects involved in the studies were included in these analyses. But when they posted the data set, they posted all of their MRIs. So unless you had read the paper and noticed that in their analysis section, they said, we ignored every left-handed subject that we posted, when you run those same software analyses or when you try to do the segmentation to get those images to all line up, you're going to have images in there that they weren't looking at. So your results are going to be different because you're not starting from the same thing. So that always makes me laugh.
Here's a question about
Yeah.
this. So how did they just grab the images that they needed? Like, is there, what was the procedure that they followed to find that? I'm just wondering, is there a formula or something that could be posted that would be like, okay, so this is how we grabbed.
Okay. So this paper was actually written after the collection of a single group of MRI studies. And they did all of that analysis before they ever posted the data. So this paper came out and the data was posted as a supplement. And it said, data created to support this paper can be found in the image repository, which I will show you. But there was no direct formula. There was nothing that said, even though all of these images were posted under this paper as supporting material, that we took out all of the left-handed ones. Because the idea of sharing data, they measured these, left-handed individuals. They got scans of them, but because there weren't enough to run the statistical analysis, they didn't include them, which is not to say that the scans were bad.
If there was a reason that the scan was bad, would someone include that in the data set, and would that be a problem?
Well, so it would depend.
Like if they said, okay, this scan is bad because there was way too much movement during it, and we need to ignore this result and not include it in our analysis.
Say, 27 subjects were scanned, number 12 was disregarded due to movement. Results are based on n-1,
Right.
because they took out that one.
And then would that be it?
But
Do you think that person would put up number 12?
probably. There's no reason that they wouldn't put up their full set, because when asked, when their paper starts with 27 subjects were scanned, that means that somebody out there is going to want to see 27 scans, whether or not they actually ended up using them all. This is a human readable methodology. But if you are taking large numbers of papers and trying to extract the data from them using a computer algorithm or an automatic crawler, you need something that's also computer readable, something that's machine actionable. And so that's why citations now have DOIs, because the DOI, while to a person is just a string of numbers, to the machine that can see the metadata behind that DOI, it is a unique and permanent identifier. This one is pretty clear. This one just says left-handed individuals were excluded. A lot of times it can be more vague. It can be said that all images that did not meet our threshold were discarded.
Okay.
And that leaves a lot to interpretation. Even if they give you, you know, what they set as the threshold for movement or for blurriness or for whatever, unless you're using the same software, unless you're using, you know, the same image reader, you may get different results. Why do we care? Why are we trying to cite data? That is one of the most basic parts of this project. And the idea that data should be considered a first-class research object, where it not only matters that you published a paper, but it matters what that paper was published about, because that data is valuable in and of itself. As I was saying earlier, citation counts and impact factors are the currency in academic science. That's what people have their grant reviews based on. Their biosketch had to include their contributions to science, which was based on their citations. Having a high impact factor or an H index for an author or publishing in a well-known journal, all of these are important. But if the science doesn't hold it up, you're missing half the story. This is actually what's called a data paper. This is published in Scientific Data, which is put out by Nature, which is one of, you know, preeminent science publications. And this paper is nothing but a description of a data set. So it says nothing about what that data says. This is just an announcement as here's the data we collected. Here are its parameters. Here's what we did with it. And it includes, at the very end, I think I just missed it, a data citation. So it shows you where you can actually find this data. And so this citation, which looks similar to a paper citation, is actually just for the data set. And when they write a paper about this data set, it will include the citation to this data so that you can, in one step, see what they were using as the basis for their research. So this is a screenshot actually from a commercial citation index. Web of Science, I don't know if you have heard of it or used it or tracks citations. You can see how often a paper is cited. You can see how often the papers it cite are cited. You can trace it out in a web. And this is actually from Thomson Reuters Data Citation Index. And so you can see they are doing the same thing. They are counting the time cited. And if you go into them, you can see who cites them, where they're cited, what publications they are, what researchers they are. And it's not only for individual data sets, they're also entire repositories. So the second one, the Peptide Atlas, is a repository of data sets. And so all of these have, in this case, DOIs, because that's what Web of Science crawls for identifiers. And they're being used. And now you can measure that use. And that use is given to you in a number. And you can compare it to other data sets of similar types. You can compare it across repositories and see what fields reuse data the most. Why should researchers care? We would all say because it's the right thing to do. I mean, that's, you know, librarians believe in the free access to information. The researchers' answer may be because they're mandated to, because the NIH says they will not fund their next grant if they cannot prove that they made their publicly funded data available. But one of the jobs of our project is to show why it can be useful. That if you can identify these these data objects, if you can show how citations can be created that uniquely and correctly identify new data sets, that they can contribute to things like your tenure file, that you can use these to show your impact across the subject field. So unfortunately, there is currently no single standard, not for data citation or for ensuring that reused data is credited both to the author of the new paper. So you should get credit if you write a paper and publish about a data set that you didn't necessarily create but that you collected. But also the people who did create that data need to be credited. You can't act as if it's your own data just because you put it together in a novel way. So this is a particular issue in neuroimaging because there are these large repositories that aggregate the same kind of image. These are, all on the same axes. They're all tagged with the same basic information about patients, their age, their handedness, their gender, their diagnoses if they had one. And the hope is that people will reuse those and that we can learn new things without having to rescan 1,000 patients every time, because at some point we may not be able to find the patients we need. But maintaining the chain of credit and making sure that the people who should be are being acknowledged is very important. So what I'm going to show you now, so this is the knowledge environment that the grant originally created. It's called the Neuroimaging Informatics Tools and Resources Clearinghouse. And so this is what it looks like. And this is widely used both nationally and internationally within the neuroimaging community, which is surprisingly bigger than you'd think. And they use it not only for images, which is what we're concentrating on, but also software and cloud computing, so that it's not only just a repository, but it is a computing host as well. So we're going to look specifically at their data image repository. And so this is what we based our project on. So we actually created a mirror of this database using the same structure for our project, but I just wanted to show you what the real thing looked at. And so these are the projects. And so they tell you what the project name is, what the project itself was, how many patients, why it was done, who was funding it, that kind of thing. So this is actually ours. This is from the UMass Department of Psychiatry, and this is 103 subjects. And in each subject, there are no less than 2 scans. So just in this one project are more than 200 images. Okay. This is our current, very rough sandbox of what a database that automatically integrates data citation could be, or how it could be used. So let's see. And this is where we started using all of our 1,000 DOI, or 1 million DOIs. So from here, you can see this is the mirror of the Nitrix. So it's the same sort of structure. Obviously, it doesn't contain as much. These are only data sets that the Department of Psychiatry itself owns and therefore can play with as much as it wants. So here is that same CANDI share. But on this one, the project itself has a DOI. And this was assigned upon upload, so that in order to create a project on the repository, you had to supply the minimum required metadata in order to create a DOI. And this is the DOI landing page. We talked at all about like DOIs and data citations and... Okay. Right. So for every DOI, there has to be a landing page. Whether or not that landing page takes you to the data or not doesn't really matter, but the landing page is where your metadata comes. That is where you can find out about what that data is or was if it has since gone away. Our metadata is based on the DataCite metadata schema volume 3.1, I believe, which was created with the intention of being a flexible data citation scheme so that it includes a lot of optional fields, includes a lot of fields that you don't necessarily have on paper citations, but that made it very easy to work with when using data. And so this was created to be human readable. This is what a person will look at. And then after I can show you what a machine would look at and what it would say. So you have the title, you have the project, you have the date, you have who created it and where they're from, contact information, pretty standard on a paper, funder, dates collected as opposed to dates published, because sometimes data may be collected and never published. It may be published about more than once, but this is strictly about the data itself. So this field documented by, this links out, this is a PubMed ID, so this is where you could attach any papers that use this data set. So this is a PubMed record. PubMed IDs, also unique and permanent identifiers because the National Library of Medicine promises that they will be. And this is the DOI of the paper that links actually to the publisher's site that was created when this was published. And if it ever loads, there you go. So this is the paper that they wrote based on this data.
Is that the same as PubMed ID?
Yes. So this will just take you to the PubMed record for that paper.
So if this data is in the future used in another paper, do you have to go back in and put the links in, or like how do you make sure that's up to date?
So we have actually automated it.
Okay.
So that is,
Someone uses it, does it update? Okay.
yep.
Okay.
Right now it only updates if they use it within our environment. So if they create a new data set and tag that data set with a DOI and add where the PubMed ID is and where the paper DOI is, those will track back to their component parts. If they write a paper and get a publisher DOI and don't ever come back to tag their data set, that right now is a hole.
Because you're doing this kind of.
Yes, because we are predicating this all on the data. So we are saying that if you search our database and find a set of data that you want to write your paper about, not only can you download it to use this data however you want, but that you have to come back and create a DOI for your data set. Whether or not it is all from one, whether or not it's spread across all 3 projects, there needs to be an identifier for that particular data set. Right now, just our small version.
Okay.
The intention is that this can be scaled up to the entire NITRIC repository. And from there, hopefully, enough people will have enough eyes on it that the same standards can be applied even in repositories with different API structures or with different database, standards, but that this is giving a set of best practices and minimum required standards for this to work. So the other thing that I wanted to see, so this is, documented by, and then this has images in project. Images in project. And so this is the list of every image and every specific DOI. This is the part of the argument I lost. But because we have that, I need to stop clicking things. This right here, this says collections using project. And so if you click that DOI, what it takes you to is a new. This is a new data set that was created, and it was created from 2 different sources. but because they are both listed by DOI, they are uniquely identified. And they are machine readable, and so that citation can be traced. And so this new data set has many parts. I didn't make this one. I usually do mine with about 6. Right, so this somebody did as a test. And it includes, so it's 311 files for 239 images. Each file, depending on where it comes from, can have different things. People post different things. Some people post separate metadata files for the images. Some people wrap them up all together. And then the rights information. So because all of these are posted in an open access database, they all carry the Creative Commons attribution license. The key features of our test database are that we chose to use DOIs as our identifiers because there are other unique identifiers out there, particularly RRIDs, which are research resource identifiers, which are very popular in biomedical research for things like antibodies and test kits that you get from companies. Because if you can adequately say, instead of having to say, we used Qiagen RNA kit number 47, lot 12, if you can have one ID that specifically says which one you used and which antibody you used, because a lot of time in science you have to use the same lot of antibody if you want to get the same results, because while it may have the same chemical structure, it has a different reactivity point because it was colder when it was created or it was warmer when it was created. So that is being used and is being integrated into paper citations and especially into methodology sections to make them machine readable, so that there is one single identifier that does the work of that whole sentence describing which test kit you used. And it hopefully reduces any chance of people not understanding which one you had. So the data site metadata schema, so volume 3.1, I linked to it. I'm not going to make you look at all 19 pages of it. But it covers all of the metadata fields that have been designated as either mandatory or optional when you are using that for identification. And then the 3 levels of the DOIs that we have. We have the image, we have the project, and those 2 are done upon creation. So when you upload a project, you get a project DOI, and that covers all of the images, which each have their own specific. But then the collection, or the functional level, is what allows for the identification of mix sets, their components, and their sources. So that functional level DOI is what this project was bent on creating, basically. Because it not only allows you to distinctly identify only the items that you're using, only the images that you needed, even after you ran your search for every 27-year-old left-handed male, but then decided that 2 of them you didn't like. You can identify that that search was, the criteria were 27 years old, left-handed, gender male, and minus those 2, all in one, without having to describe that, and hope that people can follow your logic or hope that the search bar hasn't changed and they added new fields. And the relational tags that are part of the metadata schema, such as the is part of, so that's, how a item relates to its parent project, is cited by, so that's any papers or other publications that relate to this data set, and has source is where is that individual item from. Those allow us to both iterate citations forward as things are cited, and return it backward, so that every time the component, one image is cited, its parent project gets a +1.
And so, for example, the one you, like if you're using like parent project A and parent project B in your project C, and somebody else is like, ooh, project C, this is super cool, I want to use these images as well. It doesn't even look at projects A and B, because they are tagged with has source,
Yep.
that person could pull the images from there, but your system would know which ones were A and which ones were B, and they would get the credit.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that is the goal, is that it should all be automatic, and that is why, how do I make the thing come up? That is why the way that we chose to use this data site is so important. If anyone is into coding, I can show you the XML background, and that's where actually the relational tags live. There you go. So this is the mandatory properties, the optional properties, and these are the ones that we were using. And so related identifier was a big one, and related identifier has all these subtypes, and that's has source and is from and is cited by and references. So it goes both forwards and backwards. We are in the process of writing up a white paper, trying to not only explain why we've done what we've done, but how other people can do the same thing. So it will include all of our technical specifications. It will include why we chose DOIs as opposed to RRIDs, that kind of thing. But there are still a lot of ongoing issues that we haven't necessarily fully gotten around yet. One of the big ones of those is rights and access issues. So even if a data set is posted in the NITRIC image repository, all that means is that you can see the number of patients and you can see the demographic information. But actually getting those scans may be behind some sort of access. Some projects may ask you just to sign in so they know who you are. Some may actually require full IRB approval. But on the plus side, even if you can't get to the data, the metadata is available. And sometimes that can be enough. Discoverability, it's all well and good that we're citing these things, but unless somebody is counting them and somewhere those counts are being collected, having a DOI itself is not terribly helpful. There is no search engine optimization for DOIs unless you happen to know the full numeric string. So it's machine readable, but it's not human readable. So until the standard data citation in a paper becomes normalized and becomes recognized as a required part, it's still hard to make sure that these things actually are discoverable. Things like the data citation index from Web of Science are helping. They have their own requirements, and they have sometimes very bizarre ways to get into them. You may need to be nominated to have your citations crawled by Web of Science to prove that your repository meets their standards. They may have agreements with some publishers and not others so that any supplemental data is automatically included versus other journals may not be. So that's still something that we're working on. Institutional buy-in. So just because we are really gung-ho that this matters, we need to make sure that institutions actually are willing to accept data citations as first-class research objects. This goes back a lot to the discussions of altmetrics. How much does it count? How much can it count? How much can you trust that it is correct? Because you can have the same sorts of questions about data citations. Is data citations the same as data downloads? Which one's more important? You can have somebody who, goes and automates downloading so that your number goes up, but if you never get any citations, does that mean that your data is no good? Does that mean that people are looking at it as background information but not citing it? So there are still issues. And then the inevitable scalability. So we have this working really mostly well in a small sandbox database containing 3 projects, but NITRIC itself contains, I believe it's coming up on 50 different projects with 800,000 subjects in it. So that's a lot of images. That's a lot of different standards of what's included for each project. That's a lot of people to convince that they want to participate in this and that it is a value added to their data as opposed to just being able to go back to their NIH grant reviewer and say, look, it's up in an accessible database. So what comes next? Like I said, the white paper, we are working on coming out with a publication. Whether informal or formal is still under discussion, but some sort of documentation of what we have done. And there is actually, the PIs of this project are looking into writing an informationist service into their grant. And so that is one alternative to the sustainability project, is that if you can turn an informationist project into something more long-term, it may make sense for the researchers to include your services, whether or not it will be at the same level or whether or not it will be for the same project. That's sort of dependent. This probably wouldn't work on every informationist grant. If there is a clear ending point, it makes it harder, because then, the next grant may not be going in the same direction. But and then professional opportunities. This has been, for me, one of the biggest things that I've been doing in my fellowship. And I am hoping that the experiences that I've had from this will help me in my professional development, and not only the research teams, moving forward. So I'm sure I'll have to present about it some more. Okay, I believe that's it. I'm also willing to continue playing with it if anybody wants to. Okay, that's it.
Any other questions for Leah?
I feel like I already asked a bunch of questions.
I'm also perfectly happy to answer questions about anything, how I got here, library experience, or whatever.
Can I ask you like a really big picture question?
Sure.
When you're done with it, I know you just started, but do you think about like when you're done with this grant funded position, what you want to do next?
Yes.
Ideas you'd like to share.
So I am lucky in that I am, at the same time that I am doing this grant funded work, the rest of my employment comes from a fellowship, which is intended to be a training position. And as a new librarian, I am still working out where exactly I want to go. Obviously, I happen to be very interested in scientific data management and in citation principles. But within the fellowship itself, I get to gain experience in a lot of different types of librarianship and different parts of how the library works. So I don't know where I'm going to go from here, but hopefully it will include more research team interaction. My entire background is in bench science and, biology and neuroscience, so.
I was just wondering.
Yeah, no, I wonder myself too. Oh, that was the other thing I was going to show. So this is that data citation. This is the data set paper that is only about data set, but if you click on this is their DOI for their data set. Unfortunately, this happens to be similar. It's MRI data, not a project that's included in NETRIC, just different people. And they very obviously didn't use any metadata schema. This was done by researchers. This was done by people who were just looking for a way to cite their data. And so they have their funding on there, but they don't have their names. There's no authorship. There's no institutional data. There's no time. When was this data collected?
That's really
And
they have the usage agreement, but they don't say.
well, so the usage agreement is probably dictated by their publishers.
Yeah, but it says with attribution.
Right.
So
Yep. And so they link directly. These are their data tables. That's what you can get to. There is no separation. So, so people are aware that it should be done, but this is an obvious place where an information professional could have helped do it better.
So. NIH standards are super important too. Yeah, we did just that.
I have a question just totally out of curiosity, since we're looking at this one. Is there a way in the US to link to grants like DOIs are all like always linked to, is there, I know there is in Europe, and that's why I was curious. They have a system and infrastructure, so you can link automatically to grants.
Right, so NIH grants have like long alphanumeric identifiers, and those are, you can search those in the NIH database, and you can find out who the PI is, and how many years it's been funded, and how many years total it's been funded, and how much was budgeted per year, like what institution it was, that kind of thing. That you can. It's I don't know that we do often.
The grant ID, you get
Right, you get a grant ID.
They ask you for that too, all the time. But
Yeah, you can look it up. The other thing is it also generally will only cover the federal grants. So, NIH, CDC, FDA, NSF. If your funding statement ends with personal funding from XYZ or industry funding from this and that company, you may not be able to get that information. But yeah, the national federal grants do.
Okay, I have another question. How did you, so it sounds like you were very involved in choosing the metadata that would go into the system, and I'm really curious, just as a librarian, and using your skill set, how did you figure out what was vital, what was optional, what was that process like?
Wiki arguments.
Really?
So when we were putting together the metadata schema, the landing pages, we actually took the entire scheme and all of the possible fields and set them up and started filling them out. And as we went through each one, we had to do it for a project level DOI, an image level DOI, and a collection level DOI. And then for each one, we had to make decisions about which ones were more appropriate. So geolocation is one of the optional fields. And geolocation made sense for a project because a project is done in a place. It can be where the collection is or where the project was funded. But image, putting a geolocation on a specific image, you start infringing on, PHI. And if you have a diagnosis and an age and a gender and a place, you're sort of skirting whether or not that's identifiable medical information. So that was not a field that we included on the image tags. But a lot of it was done. We had a wiki page set up where we had them all laid out and, comment back and forth, and yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if I don't think I still have those wiki pages with me. But yeah, so even though this was done with the UMass Psychiatry Department and they are, one building over and 2 floors up, my informationist desk was actually still within the library. So a lot of what I did was remote from across campus. We would video chat if meetings couldn't get scheduled in person because, the PI was doing grant review in DC, or, the computational scientist wasn't available because he works from home 2 days a week. I went to psychiatry department events and seminars, but generally by invitation I didn't like end up on any of the department listserv kind of things, which may have been more likely if I had had an actual physical place in that department. So that's one of those sort of give and takes about how embedded do you want to be. I had a separate informationist desk because you really did. I needed to have somewhere to sit that was not in the front of the library behind the service desk where my normal, library fellow position is. But I needed somewhere where I could work, where I could, do all of the background reading that are required for this paper. And yeah, so that happened to be in the back reference desk, reference office. So, yeah.
When you did meet with them?
Yes.
And sometimes it was in person and it was a weekly meeting.
Yep.
When you were around or when you went to some of the events as well, did you field any questions that were outside of this particular grant?
Some actually. There were some people who were really surprised to find a library person, at a neurobiology talk. But I was able to not only, just follow along and listen to what they were talking about, but bring up points of things like people are setting up these repositories, but have any of them considered using their institutional repositories? There are a lot of projects that might otherwise be orphaned if there is no standard subject repository for which having an institutional repository or even a regional repository could provide that framework that they could then apply these standards that we're trying to create. But yeah, so.
So what's the plan to get the field to adopt the standards that you're trying to create?
So there's going to be a small circulation of our initial white paper and technical specifications, and we are going to invite comment, and we are going to invite people who have their own repository control, their own large data sets that might fit this kind of standard, and see what their comments and what their suggestions are. I'm sure there are holes that we have not come across.
Because it was locally developed without a broad range of participants in determining some of this, will you get pushback?
I'm sure there are going to be people who think that we chose the wrong emphasis, that, it's more important to see where data is from than who else has cited that data, or like how many other functional collections does this one image end up in. But, and they may come up with points that we didn't consider. But, so that's sort of why we're hoping for feedback, although it's going to be a small initial field for comments.
It sounds like you're tracking downloads. Is that true? Like, are you tracking sort of alt metrics on it? Like, how many people are viewing the data sets?
So
In the future plan, when you do the small rollout?
No, actually. We decided that downloads were not actually what we wanted to track, because we figured that if you're trying to find the best data set to run your new analysis on, you may end up downloading 5 or 6 sort of highly related data sets. You may tweak some criteria. You may decide you need a broader age range or a smaller age range, and that if every time somebody downloaded it, it had to be identified, you'd quickly end up with so many identifiers that it turns into noise.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to identify it, just to keep a tally. Like you were saying, you get the number on Google Analytics on a web page or something like that sort of.
So I do believe that the NECDMC database does track that, but only sort of as a passive function. It's not displayed anywhere.
And they don't use anything like the product alt metrics
No.
or anything like that?
No, there is no integration, although ORCID is a field that we are trying to put in, because I spent a year at Memorial Sloan Kettering working on their institutional repository doing authority control on author names. And so having something like ORCID, if that can get hopefully mandated from something bigger than just one subject repository, but as much push behind that we can get, the better. So yes, we actually do have a field. It's not displayed because we don't have any data in it, but we have a field for author identifiers. And it also shows up in PubMed records now. You can search by them. So
people may want to use the images for other things besides research, such as education.
Yeah.
I mean, they could decide that they're going to create a data set of these images to use in teaching about autism or whatever.
Sure.
Show what the scans look like, but you're not really interested in that particular aspect, or are you?
If they were going to, we would be, because at the end of that educational program, there would assumedly be some sort of citation as to where they got those images. And so that would be enough. It doesn't have to be a research publication. It doesn't have to be, a data paper or a Nature paper.
Yeah, and that's where a more advanced metrics
Yeah.
system would come in handy, because then it could mine a PowerPoint,
Right.
whatever it was, in order to make that count.
The other big issue that we ran into was duplication. So what happens if two people use the search criteria, do all of their winnowing and exclusion of subjects that they don't want to look at, and it's something that's already been identified. So we had to put together a pretty strong hash function in the background of that database. And so currently, if you try to tag a DOI for a collection level data set that has already been created, it will return the current existing DOI. And it will add you as a new cites or a new cited by. So it will update the relation without creating a duplicate ID, which took us a really long time. That was not an easy part. I also did not do a lot of the coding. My strength is not in computer science. I was there to help talk about what the metadata fields had to do and what the relations really should be displaying, but I did not do the database architecture behind it.
Is there someone else on your team that
Yeah.
did that? Okay.
We have the third author listed is actually the computer scientist.
So you were just saying what you feel your strongest contributions were. So can you talk a little bit more about that? To the project. Like, I mean, obviously working with the metadata schema and making sure that was fleshed out to the level that made sense for the data, and organization. And how is
So what were my particular contributions? I would say that a lot of what I was there for was to help make sure that already accepted national standards were being applied. So I had the knowledge that something like DataCite was out there and that put out a metadata schema and that they're updating it regularly. Even something as basic as the Creative Commons license, there was a lot of issue because actually originally in NITRIC, the repository itself had a different level of restriction than the projects that were posted. And that was a copyright issue. And so that was something that had to be addressed before we could even go forward with this. They relied on me to ensure that they were basically following these sorts of standards. So I was answering questions as to, why is this better than that? What's the evidence showing that it should be done one way, not the other?